as lions.
As bold as lions. As bold as lions.
As bold as lions.
As bold as lions.
You're listening to the As Bold as Lions podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to this edition of the As Bold as Lions podcast. Very excited to have you join me and to dive into some new content here today. Been a good start to September so far, just getting into this month and staying busy with things, getting into the fall. I know fall is right around the corner because a lot of the telltale signs of fall are noticeable, are visible. One of the big ones is that football season has kicked off. And you see it everywhere, whether you're somebody who lives in the States, in the U.S., or you're outside of the States. Maybe it's a little bit more of a stretch for you to imagine. But here in the States, in the U.S., when it's football season, it's really a whole culture shift that's kind of hard to avoid, even if you're not a huge fan. And I know in the U.S. we call it football. In the rest of the world, football is what we call soccer. So it's a little bit different. We've been seems to be that the NFL has been trying to export American football into other countries. I don't know how that's going. I don't know how that's being received, but I see where they're playing games all the time and in other places. So maybe it's catching on. But here in the U.S., we love our football, whether it's high school level, where you kind of have these Friday night lights sort of thing, that whole subculture of football. And then you have the college games, usually on Saturdays, which is you can just kind of start your day with all the pregame stuff and just watch games and get updates all day long if that's your thing. And then on Sundays, we have the professional level, the NFL, the National Football League. And NFL games, I guess, are primarily on Sundays, but then we have them, throughout the rest of the week, Monday nights, Thursday nights. Just kind of, it's just, we're starting now, and for the next few months, it's going to be football everywhere. So, I don't follow it as much as I used to. Growing up in Minnesota, I'm a Vikings fan, still am a Vikings fan, but they're hard teams sometimes to follow because there's a lot of ups and downs, mostly downs, it seems like, within the season for the Vikings. We always kind of say, maybe this is going to be our year going into the new year of football, and then at some point during the season, we'd say, well, there's always next year. We kind of start looking forward to the next year and the next year. So with my kids, we just drafted our fantasy teams this week for football. They're into it, so I try to keep up as much as I can, and that's just kind of a friendly inter-family thing that we do where we put our rosters together and we go to head to head with each other each week. So something that keeps us kind of involved in the game, even if our favorite teams or some of our favorite players are having, whatever kind of season they're having, we can get into the fantasy level thing a little bit. So football is here. That's kind of this big fall thing that I associate with the fall. And then, just other stuff like the whole pumpkin spice latte deal, and pumpkin everywhere. Pumpkins all over the place from now until, I don't know, November, Thanksgiving, maybe even beyond. I usually at some point have to get some pumpkin spice latte drink somewhere. Try one. If you know of a place that has a really good one, I'm always open to suggestions, but I'll usually pick up that pumpkin creamer for your coffee and give that a try for a few weeks or whatever. But just getting into the spirit, getting into the fall kind of mindset of things. So I could go on that tangent of football and pumpkins for a while, and I'm sure I'd bore you to tears, but I need to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of what content we're diving into today, which is this series called Profiles in Courage. And I'm excited about this. I'll tell you why. I think I mentioned last time I was going through, you go through your phone, your camera roll, all the pictures that you kind of accumulate or screenshots of things, and just always trying to clean that up and get rid of stuff because I know it takes up space on my phone, and what can I delete? And a few years ago, I had these other images that I was going to use for further Profiles in Courage episodes. I guess I don't know why I didn't continue with it, but I saw these, the other day, and I'm like, I should really go back and kind of reboot that series and go to these last few characters that I never talked about. And so that kind of just, jogged my memory to go there. And, I'd done the series twice over the last few years, and you can go back and find, I went back myself to just kind of to locate them. Episodes number 23 through 26 were a 4-part series. The first one that we did, and that had David, Joseph, Stephen, and Esther. And those were all from July 2021. So wow, 3 years ago already. And then episodes 55 through 58, which were then Gideon, Noah, John the Baptist, and Elijah. And those were in February and March of 2022. So we're going on 2 to 3 years, from talking about this series. But I feel like the content is still kind of, it's not still kind of, it is, it's evergreen. It's stuff that you can always kind of go back to and talk about these characters. And certainly in our Bible study, you grow up going, if you've been in church most of your life and you're a kid and you learn about David and Goliath, or you talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, or, Moses in the Red Sea. Like you hear all of these stories, and they're just kind of cemented somewhere in your brain of just Bible heroes, but kind of going back to those stories, some of them, and talking about them as an adult and being like, okay, there's a lot here that's applicable to me, not just as a kid hearing this story, but now as a grown man hearing it. So the series, I think, was kind of formative. I mentioned, that first batch of 4 was 3 years ago, and that was really when I was just launching this podcast in 2021. You go back to your life in 2020, 2021. There's a lot going on in those months, and I don't think any of us really want to go back and revisit that time, but we know what we were living through at that time, and that's kind of what spurred me to start doing the topic of Profiles in Courage. So encourage you to go back to those if you haven't yet heard all those other ones, because I really think they've been a part of the life of this podcast and made it part of what it is now. So that leading me to say, why come back to it now? Aside from finding those images on my camera roll on my phone and kind of having that trigger the thought, which was a spark to begin it again. I think I'm always just going back to the Bible to find and identify with the heroes of the faith who inspire my walk with Christ. Are these perfect men or women? No, certainly not. They're not perfect. They have flaws. They made mistakes, but we know Jesus is the only one who is perfect. But even in their frail humanity, even in the mistakes that they made, they point us to what it means to follow along this narrow path of faith. And I think we need their stories so much in these days. I think there is tie-in from what they faced in their own time periods that we can then directly correlate to much of our time period today, our days. Like the saying says, history repeats itself. Nothing is truly new. The refrain that you keep hearing in Ecclesiastes from Solomon is that there's nothing new under the sun. There are things that will just always be, as we keep living life and time moves forward and mankind, however long it has before the return of Christ, they're going to keep doing the things that they do on a sinful, fallen planet that we just realize, we can always kind of go back to something in the past that seems like it speaks into what's happening now. There's some key things as we start kind of transitioning into our content today. There's some key things that are common threads to all these stories, I think. And I was just kind of brainstorming this, whether it's the ones that we've covered in the past, the ones I'm covering now, or really any characters that you go into the Bible that have much of a narrative that you can dig into. There's some bullet points that I just thought these are things that almost are common to all of them. It's first of all, these profiles encourage individuals. They relied on the Lord. They relied on God to provide the steps forward, even when they couldn't see them, even when it's like, I've got to move forward and I can't even see what the next step is. I'm going to rely on the Lord in this particular matter. Secondly, their faithful obedience usually cost them something. And so as they're stepping out to do something for the Lord, as today we talk about Abraham and we talk about a particular scenario in his life, this is a step that counts them something, and they have to count the cost of what that will mean to follow the Lord and be obedient. On most of them, the odds were tremendously stacked against them. This is a third point to just kind of share and think of. You have Esther, who goes before the king. If I die, I die. I'm going to go before him on behalf of my people. You have Gideon, whose army is whittled down to this small size to then go and fight a battle. Elijah, who goes up against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and just it's one man against hundreds. They have the worst possible odds stacked against them. Another point, their faith then becomes a lamppost and a guidepost for others around them and others that would follow in their path. It's kind of even as we're talking about them now, these are guideposts for us along our journey in Christ. And just the last thing that I think is a commonality is we remember their names because they answered the call. The ones who did not step out in faith, and we know there had to have been many, we have no record of them. We don't know their names, but the ones who did, the Daniels, the Davids, the Pauls, the John the Baptist, these men, these women, Ruth, Esther, we know their names because they answered this call upon their lives. And for me, that's just kind of a profound reality of like, will my name be known? Not because I'm something great in and of myself, far be it from me to seek fame, glory, anything, but will people know who I was, or at least my own heirs to the next few generations, my sons, my grandsons, and down the line, will they have any record of me because I stood in faith in my own life? So as we restart this series for another 4 weeks, 4 characters, I want to take the first 2 and go in the Old Testament. We'll be looking at Abraham today, and we'll look at Daniel next time. And then I want to take 2 from the New Testament, and we'll look at Peter and Paul. And over these next 4 weeks, we're just going to dive in. There's many chapters and many verses that are devoted to these men. The 4 that I just mentioned, we could do a study on each one of them, and it could take us many weeks. We could do a whole Daniel study, and believe me, I'm not the guy to do that, but we could spend months studying the book of Daniel, and we could spend months studying the life of Paul. But we're going to usually just go into a specific story, something that we can just kind of spend our time together in, and then use that as an encouragement, and use that for each time that we do these episodes, and realize that their faith was stretched in that moment, and they either had to move forward in trust in the Lord or shrink back in disbelief. So Abraham's our first profile and courage for this restart of this series, the one we're going to look at today. And I wanted to look at God's call to him in Genesis 22. If you want to put a finger or a bookmark in Genesis 22 as we go through, feel free. This was a call to Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And this is an uncomfortable one to start with. Why? Because we don't want to believe, or we don't want to think that our God could even make that sort of an ask of us, that sort of a request of an Abraham, of any of us. But we're going to see how this wasn't just some random ask of the Lord. This was really a point in which God was using this whole scene, this whole event, to test Abraham, his servant. And he wants to rid his heart of anything that is less than 100% commitment, 100% devotion level to his God. So I'm going to have 3 points today. But before I go into those, before I go into each individual point, I'm going to read a section to get us started. And this is all from Genesis 22. I'm going to read verses 1 through 8 first, and then we're going to go on our first point, and then we'll read the next part, go to the next point, and so on. I'm in the ESV, the English Standard Version. That's usually where I'm at in the Bible version translation that I use. You might be in something else. That's great. But we're in Genesis 22, and we're beginning with verse 1. Here we go. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them, together. So that's some heavy reading, even just to read that and just think of the poignancy of what Abraham is walking into as a father. And even just reading that, I'm just like, kind of just have to take a minute and just process that again. But my first point, just trying to segue right into this, my first point is that Abraham, although perhaps inwardly conflicted, he outwardly displayed absolute dependence and obedience on God. Abraham, although inwardly conflicted, perhaps, Outwardly, he displays absolute obedience on God. And that's verse 3, this kind of centering in on that. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. There's no moment here, and if you know this story, you've probably heard it many, many times over your life. But there's no moment where Abraham was like, hey, wait a minute, God. Hold up, God. There was no Abraham just kind of hitting pause and saying, let me pray on that for a little while. Let me just maybe seek some counsel here. I'll get back to you. There was none of that. We get no hint of that from the story. Abraham hears God, and snap of the finger, he obeys wholeheartedly. That's what I read. That's how I take this. And we know Abraham's had other close encounters, even kind of this one-on-one type of interaction with the Lord. He knows the voice of the Lord. He's familiar enough with that. He knows when God is asking something of him. He also knows, hey, God's fulfilled a promise to me that came by him blessing my life, my wife and I, Sarah. He's blessed us with a son, with Isaac. God calls, and Abraham, not having a clue what the Lord is going to desire, what the Lord's going to say, what he's going to ask, he just simply says, here I am, just faithful obedience. I have no idea what sort of inner conflict, inner turmoil is going on inside of his head. I can only speculate that his mind was probably going a mile a minute. His heart was racing. His hands probably trembling and shaking as he's preparing to do this thing that God is calling him to do, is sacrifice his only son. And I think this is where we can take a lot from his example. Because we know that God is going to call us into deeper levels of faith as we walk with him. And we're going to experience some of these Abraham, Genesis 22 kind of moments where there's some testing that comes with that. Things that are going to make us uncomfortable. Things that are not going to be easy as we're walking through them. There may be financial things. There may be health-related things. There may be job changes and transitions, moves. It may be trusting him with our kids as they start to grow up and even as they move away. And I'm right there at this moment. It's giving up something to the Lord with the hopes that he will somehow give it back to us someday. But still not knowing, still having that possibility of what if it doesn't come back, or what if something that I give up to the Lord, this sacrifice that I perform for him, that I offer to him, is just then something that I don't get back. Into these things, I believe we're called to simply say, here I am, as Abraham does. And as the Lord is knocking on the door of our hearts, he's asking for us to give up and surrender that thing. And hopefully we've developed this level of trust like in Abraham, where he's already had enough he's already seen enough to say, even though I don't know what you're going to lead me through, God, I'm going to trust you. I've seen you come through before. Even though you're asking me to sacrifice what you promised to me, I'll do that if that's what you want. This is a promise that you fulfilled. You gave me all the insight and the foreknowledge that this was going to happen, and now I have this son, and now you're calling me to sacrifice and surrender him. I'll do that if that's what you want. And guys, that first point, just kind of ending on this, that's faithful obedience. And that's what the Lord is looking for in us. That's something that I think we can take away from Abraham in this story. So reading on in Genesis 22, verses 9 through 14, as we go into our next point, it says this. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. That's, verses 9 through 14. So bringing us into our second point here, Abraham's obedience leads to a place of God's provision. Abraham is obedient, God provides. We just read it here, but that last verse states it. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Had he not obeyed, perhaps he would not have seen the great provision God intended to bring to him. This ram that's caught in the thicket was a sign. God's not going to require Isaac's sacrifice. Rather, now I know that you fear God. He's saying this to Abraham. I know you have not withheld even your only son from me. God is after the heart of each and every person to know whether or not they are fully committed to him. And could it be these kind of scares, these scary things that God's asking of us, the big asks that we see in life? Are these ways that he is then peeling away the layers somehow that are on our hearts, everything that's not fully devoted and consecrated to him? See, those fires that we walk through that are unavoidable, it seems. Could it be they are something he is using to test the devotion of our faith and then remove any impurities that we may have? See, Abraham wasn't looking for this test. He didn't, finally have Isaac and then looking for God to push his faith further in this way. And maybe he even thought, I finally got the fulfillment of the blessing. Isaac is here as God promised. But maybe he was more caught up in that promise itself and not in the promise giver, the one who gave it to him. I don't know about you, but I can be just caught up in this life. I can be enamored with the things of this life, even the good things that God gives me, like a spouse and a family, a job, a house, cars, education, just the good things of life. But what if God took all of those things away in an instant, like an Abraham situation or like a Job type of situation? Would we still trust him through that? Because Abraham obeys, God provides. He comes up to the point of almost sacrificing Isaac. He's ready. I'm envisioning Isaac's on the altar. He's bound. He's got the wood. He's got everything, and he's got the knife up, and he's ready. Again, probably with trembling hands and maybe just tears running down his face, ready to sacrifice him because this is God, what you've called me to do. But God says, stop. God says, all right. The ram is provided and offered instead. And Abraham, Isaac is released and they offer the ram. And what a moment, what a sigh of relief that must just wash over him in that moment. There's a verse from Hebrews 11:17 through 19. The hall of faith of Hebrews is kind of Abraham's account in there. These verses that tie in. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. The writer of Hebrews is telling us Abraham had faith to the point of even if God did require his life, God could raise him back if he wanted to. That's some absolute trust there, and that's some absolute faith. And I love that Abraham points us to that. Before going into our last point, I'm going to read the last kind of section of this, which is Genesis 22, verses 15 through 19. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So we talked about Abraham, even if he was inwardly conflicted, outwardly he's showing an absolute obedience and trust in the Lord. Second point, that obedience leads him to a place of receiving God's provision. The sacrifice was provided for him, and he didn't have to offer up Isaac. Thirdly and finally, God does not forget his promise to Abraham. Verse 17 here, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore." A few chapters back, we see before Isaac is born, in Genesis 15, God says this, verses 5 and 6, "And he brought him outside and said, 'Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." The background image of this episode, this specific one for Abraham, is Abraham's name, and then I have just kind of a blue backdrop that looks like just a bunch of stars, just a starry night in the sky. And that was purposeful because even in detailing these events in Genesis 22, we see that God was not going to let this promise just fall to the ground. He's a God who keeps his promises. And the promise for Abraham was that his descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky, vast and without number. And at the point this promise is given to Abraham, Abraham could not even imagine this. He couldn't even wrap his mind around this because he didn't have any offspring. He didn't have a son to carry on his lineage. His wife and him are quite old. But by Genesis 22, he has to be thinking, okay, I now have a son. Perhaps this is possible, God. Perhaps one day I will have lots and lots of descendants. That's why this ask of God had to have been so hard, had to have been something that just wrestled with it at some point, but he surrendered it. His faith was going to now have to pass a test beyond anything that it had faced before, and if God was really God, he could still give Abraham back Isaac somehow, some way. Here's where this promise comes full circle. What God asked of Abraham, Abraham did. The faith he needed to display here, he displayed it. And God kept his end of the deal, making Abraham the father of many, many nations, like the sand on the seashore, like the stars in the sky. Are we able to look at the promises of God in this light as well? Can we see that the work he's started doing in us is going to be completed someday? Can we cling tightly and hold on to that promise, knowing he's faithful to make good on what he says he's going to do? Whether it's a prodigal son or daughter that you're praying to come back to the Lord, a broken marriage that needs to be healed, or just some need to be provided, is he able? Can we trust him with those things? Can he do it? As we close out this last point and we start moving to the conclusion of this episode, I pray that you're able to see the Lord in that light. I pray that no matter what life's throwing at you right now, you're still able to see God as the one who still provides, the God who is always on time, the God who has not and will never forget or abandon you. As we close, I'm reminded that the promise of God, it didn't just stop with Abraham and Isaac. There's this vast lineage that is throughout the rest of Scripture, this beautiful story that then includes Jesus Christ, our Lord. Here's the difference. God did not spare his only son. God did not provide another way when it was time to sacrifice his son. Jesus went to the cross, and in the same way that Abraham had a ram to take the place of Isaac, Jesus takes the place for us as well, for our sin, for the death that we rightfully deserved. And I know I've shared it on here many times before on the podcast, but that gospel message ties in so closely today that I can't finish this without mentioning it. Because if you don't know Jesus, you can know him. And you can have that assurance of salvation in him. The ABCs of salvation, for me, it's the easiest way I can share it with you is A, admit that you're a sinner. B, believe that Jesus died for your sins. C, confess him as Lord. Those are the basic steps to take into coming into relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's a prayer that you can just pray simply before him. That just incorporates those things. God, I'm a sinner. I believe that you sent Jesus, your son, to die for my sins. And I just confess you as Lord. And if that's offered from your heart and done in sincerity, I believe he comes in and he lives inside of you through his Holy Spirit. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have as you consider this, as you maybe hear all of this and it's stirring your heart, but you don't know where to go with it. I'd love to talk with you further. Finally, for just the believer who's listening today, those who are already in Christ, Abraham's testimony as a profile encourages proof that you and I can indeed trust this God with our lives. Maybe you're in a place where you feel like that trust is lost and it's hard to open up yourself once again. You're a little bit guarded against what God might ask of you right now or what he is asking of you. I'd encourage you, trust him again. Surrender to him again. Whatever he is asking you to lay down, whatever is your Isaac, be able to surrender it and stop fighting against him. He's not going to allow your feet to falter. Psalm 121 verse 3, he will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Can you open up your heart once again to receive him and let him lead? I pray that you can. As it's been just a joy to walk through this, to talk about Abraham, Father Abraham, who had many sons, that old song that we used to sing, true in these days as we look back and we see just how God used him and brought forth a mighty nation through him and through Isaac. But he had to be willing to surrender Isaac first. Love that story. We're going to go into Daniel next time. We're going to go into the lion's den. So I hope you'll come back and join me for another one of these profiles episodes. But until then, I'm going to leave you with our theme verse. And that is from Ephesians 5:15 through 17. How we end every As Bold as Lions podcast says this: be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Take care. God bless you guys.
Hey guys, this is Derek Charles Johnson. You have been listening to the As Bold as Lions podcast. I am a blogger, a songwriter, an artist. And if you've been encouraged by this podcast, please go ahead and subscribe and share, and head over to DerekCharlesJohnson.com for more encouraging content. God bless.